Welcome to another 5-minute religious education recap video. We're on the study of a world faith, looking at Judaism, and we're focusing on the Jewish beliefs half of the paper. Today's session is going to look at covenants, and hopefully we'll look at the meaning and significance of the covenants. Session might be a little bit longer and run over, so let's get cracking. First of all, covenant is a key term, and it's a promise or an agreement between two parties. So covenant's been made between God and Noah, Abraham and God, and Moses and God. But in particular for your exam, you need to be aware of the covenant with Abraham and with Moses. Just before we get into that, I'm going to give you a bit of context about what's going on with Abraham and what's going on with Moses. For Abraham then, God asks Abraham to leave his land, okay? Even though he's at a great age, he promises him a new land. And then God promises Abraham that he'll have many descendants. He also promises Abraham a son, and eventually his son Isaac is born. God then asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham, he goes to do it, but God stops him at the last minute. Now Moses, as the Jews are looking for this promised land, they eventually settle in the land of Egypt, but then they're put into slavery. Moses, he's actually brought up in Pharaoh in the Egyptian's palace. Moses then runs away, but God speaks to him through a burning bush and asks him to free the Jews from slavery. Moses goes back, he punishes the Egyptians with the 10 plagues of Egypt. Eventually they're given their freedom, and as they're escaping, Moses has to part the Red Sea. They get onto the other side, he goes up Mount Sinai, receives the 10 commandments, and after this, God starts to guide the Jews once again through to the promised land. So let's start with Abraham then. Now the reason Abraham's so important is because he establishes the first and everlasting covenants with God. He's also seen as kind of the father of monotheism, so he brings about together this belief in one God. But also throughout his life, he shows that he's loyal and he's faithful to God, qualities that Jews need to replicate. Now starting off with the first covenant then. God calls Abraham and his family to a new land, the promised land. All Abraham and his family have to do is be faithful and trust in God, and then God will give them a new home to live in. This is why in Genesis it says, "Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you." Second covenant, God promises that he's going to make a great nation from Abraham. All Abraham and his family have to do is be faithful and trust God. God will bless them and give them many descendants. Again, in Genesis it says, "I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you." So what we look at here is the idea that, as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there are thousands of grains of sand, there are thousands of stars, and the idea is that's how big Abraham's family are eventually going to be. Third part of the covenant, God promises to bless Abraham and his family, but in return Abraham must circumcise every male in the family before they're 8 days old. And what God will do is he will bless and protect those that are circumcised, and those who are not, he will cut off and they will no longer be considered Jewish. And this is why it says in the Torah, you are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. So in summary, Abraham is really important because God promises the promised land to Abraham, and that is the home of Judaism, and that's why Israel is seen as the home of Judaism. Abraham establishes that belief in monotheism, that belief in one God. And finally, the rite of circumcision has been established with God and Abraham. Now moving on, let's look at Moses. Now Moses is really important because he's the one who frees the Jews from slavery. Also, God reveals the Torah to Moses, and then Moses passes that on to the Jewish people. And therefore, Moses is this person who's seen as kind of, the prophet or this kind of great communicator with God. And that's why Maimonides says he's the father of all prophets. Now, perhaps most famously, Moses is given the 10 Commandments. Now, I've done a separate video on this, so it'll probably be worth watching that. But there's going to be a lot of information coming on screen. Feel free to pause and read through this. But in a nutshell, the 10 Commandments are so important because they teach Jews how to worship God, but also how to treat others. Now, Moses then, the covenants which actually get established, God calls Moses to free the Jews, even though Moses doesn't feel he's capable. All Moses has to do is trust and believe in God, and then God will always be with Moses and will always be there to guide and protect the Jews. This is why in Exodus it simply says, "I will be with you." Secondly, God promises to deliver the Jews to the promised land. Moses has to lead the Jews out of slavery, and then God will lead the Jews to that promised land. And this is why in Exodus it says, "And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into a land flowing with milk and honey." Hence the image on the board. It's going to be a land that's going to be sweet and it's going to be full of life. So again, this part of the covenant is lead them out of slavery. I will deliver you to the promised land. Finally, God provides laws and teachings for the Jews to follow. All Moses has to do is go up, receive the 10 Commandments, the Torah, come back down and get the Jews to follow these. And all this does is God is showing the Jews how to worship him and how to treat each other. And a simple bit of evidence for that is the 10 Commandments in Exodus. So ultimately then, looking at Moses and the idea of the covenant and why it's so important, well, Jews remember the escape from Egypt through the festival of the Passover. So that covenant that was established of Moses freeing the Jews, that's remembered through the Passover. The Ten Commandments, they are reflected through the prayer, daily prayer of the Shema, and even the way that synagogues are created with no statues, that upholds the Ten Commandments. Jews also keep the Sabbath holy every single week by remembering the Ten Commandments. That's part of the covenant. Jews also, the way they treat their marriage and relationships is reflected from that covenant with the Ten Commandments. For example, not committing adultery. And also, because of the covenant with the Ten Commandments, Jews have a respect and regard for the sanctity of life, of protecting life no matter what. That's reflected through the do not kill commandments. Now, have a look at the screen. This is getting you to evaluate and debate which covenant appears more significant. You can see we've got the covenant with Abraham, but then the covenant with Moses. Now, in a bit of a nutshell, if I was looking at this, I'd be saying, well, do you know what? Abraham did establish the initial monotheism. He did create the everlasting covenant, and he did show loyalty and faithfulness to God, and he did establish that idea of the circumcision and Jewish identity. But without Moses, you wouldn't have the basic laws for the Jews to follow. You wouldn't have those Ten Commandments, and also impacts on Jews' daily lives by looking at things like praying the Shema every day, having that weekly Shabbat meal. So it's up to you now, but you need to have a look at this and think to yourself which covenant, Abraham's or Moses, appears more significant. Well, look down the checklist, see if you can link these key terms into the meaning and significance of the covenants. If you can do that, you've been successful. If you want to push yourself a little bit further, try some of these example questions. Whatever you get up to, thank you so much for listening because there's been a lot of content, and take care of yourselves.